Welcome back. Tricia Thompson Willingham and myself, Dr. Susan Zoll, have co authored Implementing the Montessori Method Learner Centered Education from Birth Through Adolescence. And in this episode, we'll be looking at a section of the chapter focused on middle and high school classrooms. In our observations of Montessori classrooms, we came across a middle school where students used an app called equitymaps. And today we'll talk with the developer, Dr. David Nelson. Hi, Dave. It's really nice to meet you. We've been discussing your equity maps and the new book, I would say over the past year and a half, but only via email. So it's great to see you officially. I hope one day we can meet in person. I'm wondering if you could just begin by telling us a little bit about yourself, where you're located, your role in education.
Thanks so much, Susan. It's great to finally meet you. Yes, we've only been emailing back and forth, and it's really exciting to hear the release of your book. I just picked it up on Amazon, by the way, so I haven't started reading it, but I did flip through a few of the chapters to get a sense, and very impressive. So I'm looking forward to it. My name is Dave Nelson. I'm entering my 36th year in education, and I'm originally from Oregon, where I taught in Hillsborough for quite some time before I went internationally. I'm currently the high school principal in Buenos Aires at Asociación Escuelas Lincoln. It's in Buenos Aires. It's an American international school. And I'm recently coming from Athens, Greece, where I was a principal, teacher, professional development guy. So it's been an incredible career filled with my origin as a teacher. And I also work as a professional development facilitator with the National School Reform Faculty out of Bloomington, Indiana. We specialize in critical friends group work. You might have used some of the protocols in your past. And I'm also the founder of Equity Maps. So I'm thrilled to be able to meet with you and talk about that today.
So I first had the opportunity to see equity maps in action. Actually, before I saw it in action, I had seen a version of it in a young man, Andrew Falstich, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, was at a conference and he was discussing adolescent environments and he had this diagram of conversations and I was like, ooh, what is this? So he taught a little bit about it, and then go forward, I don't know, at least a year later, Trisha and I were doing observations. We were at a Montessori school in Virginia, and the students were using an iPad, and the iPad was tracking the conversations just as I had seen in that diagram a year previously in that presentation. And so I went right up to her and I was like, tell me about this one. And that's where I learned about the app itself, Equity Maps. So we've seen it used in an adolescent classroom, and that's when we reached out. And I was like, who developed this? Okay, how are we going to find him? Thank goodness for LinkedIn. And thank goodness for you responding. So if you could describe the app and how you came about using it or developing it.
Yeah, thanks for your story too, because I am not a businessman by any means, and okay, an innovator, but an educator first. And developed equity maps out of an intersection of my work in the classroom and with professional development in discovering ways to make discussion and dialogue visible to students and inclusion much more accessible in a real practical way. Uh, I developed Equity Maps 10 years ago now. It's a decade. And I love your story, especially because I have spent no money on advertising. All of the sales go back into the development. And I really haven't made much money. It's really just the joy of seeing it used and seeing how users catch on to its practical purposes in the classroom. And that's exactly why we're in education. And that's why I developed the app. So it's cool to hear those stories. The app itself is a way of making conversations and dialogue visible so that it creates a map of the interactions that take place in the classroom, almost like in a spider web-like fashion. And in that making of that diagram, it's also accessing and tracking the data of how much each of the students or each of the participants speak, how often they speak, And now you can track the types of contributions that they make. So it's an incredible tool for teachers to be able to um, bring data points to what the students are actually interacting with in the classroom, and to make it visible. I like to say it's kind of like a mirror into those conversations, and that data creates a less threatening way of seeing their interactions. And we could talk a lot more about how I've seen that and how that works out in the real world. But it's really fun to see users and talk to them and listen to how they're using it in the classroom.
So here's an image, one snapshot from equitymap. Could you describe what's happening here?
Sure. So as you're mapping, or as the teacher or a student is mapping the conversation, they're tapping on each of the speakers as they're speaking. And on the right-hand side, you'll see this flow of the conversation, and it's recording their audio if you so choose to record the audio. And each of the lines represents the order in which the participants are speaking. And after the conversation, the group can access that to see in a fast forward motion. If it's a 30-minute meeting, you can watch it in less than 30 or 40 seconds of how the lines are connected. And at the end of a conversation, I always ask the students or participants, what do you notice? And when we access a lot of the data, we can see graphs of how much different individuals spoke, how long they spoke. And what I've found in talking to a lot of users is when they see it as an image, we're not talking about them necessarily, although their name is there. What we find is that the students start to open up to describing what they're seeing as a third point, refer to the third point of communication. And it really opens up the possibilities. I remember a story when I was the very first year we had this out, and I was conducting a Socratic seminar in a class. There were maybe 20 students in the circle, inner circle. And afterwards, I showed the statistics and I asked the students just to write down what they noticed. And then I asked them to share out. And I remember very specifically, Irini, she raised her hand and she said, look at this. And it was the statistic that showed the gender, because the boys in that class were rather assertive. And it showed 70 to 30% of the boys dominating that conversation in this 10th grade integrated social studies English class. And she popped up and she said, this is exactly how I have felt every time we're in this class. And it was through the data she was able to say that, because it wasn't her speaking, it was the data. And what it led to was a debrief of the conversation. And the students then started to set goals for the next Socratic seminar as they were coming up with their norms, that they would allow more equitable conversation so that everyone had a chance to speak. It was phenomenal, and that was the first year I was when I had it in the classroom, and then it was a confirmation. Okay, this is something I've got to keep going and get into the hands of other people. That was pretty cool.
Yeah, it is very cool. Just that whole equity piece, I can look here and both Ben and Evie, there's no line attached to them. And it's not to say that every time we have a group discussion that everybody needs to participate. But over time, again, as you're talking about the data, whether I'm the educator or I am classmates with the students, I need to be aware of it. If I'm the leader of that group and I'm now aware of this and I can watch this real time, I can make sure that I can go back to Evie and to Ben and say, is there something you would like to add to this conversation? Sometimes people just need a gentle invitation to join the discussion.
Yeah, I love that, Susan. And I think the difference is people who have really done work in the classroom with dialogic practices, whether it's Socratic seminars or Harkness, it's not a way of evaluating a student. It's not a way of evaluating the group. It's a methodology for students to be able to engage in the learning, engage with one another to create understanding. And so in the users, I did some research in my dissertation, as a matter of fact, where I did a case study of Equity Maps users to try to understand how they were applying their pedagogy. And out of the 16 people who I had in the case study, 14 of them, 13 or 14 of them didn't use it for anything as far as a grade or evaluation. It was only part of the pedagogy. And I think tech tools these days so often, and I'm interested in knowing more from the Montessori perspective, because I think tech tools in education have become, the shiny tool. We got to have the latest, or how it is presented as the tech tool. Here, it's about pedagogy first. It's about pedagogy and finding a way to enhance the pedagogy with a practical tool, a practical way of doing that. And that's really where it started.
I just love this. I continue to love this tool. I hope that everybody downloads your app and begins to use it with their students. I saw it being used very skillfully at an adolescent level. I could also see it being used even in an elementary classroom. And when we think about the polarization that's happening here in our country, especially, what a tool just for folks to have, much like you described with the young woman earlier, having confirmation of their perception of what's happening in a group discussion, but also for those who might have lots of lines going to them, that they can have an understanding through data, not through someone else, right, telling them, but they can have this aha moment and begin to not just be aware, but to change their own practices in dialogue with someone else. So I just think it's a brilliant tool and so, so needed today.
Thank you so much, Susan. And it's interesting because when I first started, okay, I started teaching in 1990. We go way back. And this is pre-technology, right? And I remember teaching a leadership class, and you might have had a similar experience where we had a ball of yarn and we would sit in a circle and toss the yarn around. And that visual of making sure everyone spoke, that's really the origin story of this. Because when I went into Socratic seminars later, I started to do it on paper, much like Phillips Exeter recommends doing for Harkness, doing a map on paper to show students afterwards. And this visual, what does this tell us about our interactions? What does this tell us about what we can learn from one another?
Raises some other pedagogies that I feel like you align with. For example, you were talking about making discussions visible. So there's in Reggio Emilia, it's about making children's thinking visible, right, through documentation. And this just feels like another way of moving in that direction. And then the other piece that this reminds me of also, well, there's two things. One is dialogic reading. I'm a literacy person, and it's about getting in dialogue with children during the storytelling in order to get to a deeper comprehension. There's also something called serve and return, and striving for five, which the Center for the Developing Child has been promoting at Harvard University, has been promoting for a while now. You can find that on their website. What they're looking for in this dialogic process, especially between an adult and child. And if we think about a pedagogy in a traditional classroom, sometimes teachers' dialogue, quote unquote, is more functional. Time to put your things away. Everybody turn to page 36. Go and line up at the door. That's not dialogue, right? And so helping teachers to understand what is dialogue, and that's partly what this Strive for Five is. One person will say something and the other person will respond. That's one. And then that person may pose a question back and the original person will respond. That's two. Can we get to five? And what I recommend for teachers is more like a self-evaluation, like check off the number of times that you're talking with children. Is it all kind of functional to get you through your day? Or do we actually have opportunity to build language, to learn about students as a social emotional component to this? How are we spending our time in conversation with our students, regardless of their age? Even infants and toddlers deserve that kind of exchange.
I am really excited to learn more about this Strive for Five because that's something that language is something new that I haven't come across yet. So I will definitely look that up, Susan. And it reminds me a lot of the foundational work, and I'm sure that Harvard is building from this finding of the IRE. It's called Initiation Response Evaluation.
Mm,
And John Hattie discovered it more than 15 years ago now, that teachers are engaging in monologic talk, teacher talk, and in the high school it can become even more toxic. It's become overwhelming because teachers are trying to cover their curriculum per se, and some believe that the only way to cover their curriculum is to drive through that curriculum. I always say to the teachers and my staff that telling is not teaching. So this strive for five sounds so interesting because what researchers have found is in the IRE, when a teacher asks a question, the student responses, unfortunately, usually the fastest and quickest student, and in a minimal number of students who are interacting, they respond with a hopefully, well, usually a lower level question. Hopefully, it's a higher level question, but they're still responding. The I is the initiation, the R is the response, and the E is the evaluation. Because typically, what happens is the teacher ends the conversation saying, "Good job, Johnny.
mm, mm,
Excellent. You got it."
mm.
And the assumption goes on in the mind that everyone's got it. Well, if we strive for five, like you're saying, you follow that with a question or some other initiation or response to widen that. And if we mix it with the use of wait time before and after the question, and even after the response, it opens that dialogue in the classroom. And for me, this is the most powerful. With equity maps, another use as an administrator that I've used it is in classroom observations to be able to map the conversations of the interactions in the classroom in that given period. And I always ask the teachers first, of course, to say, is this something that you would like to see in how much time each student is talking, how much you're talking? And inevitably, when we go back to look at the data, it's fascinating because I ask them to estimate how much they spoke and how much they thought each of the students spoke. And almost always they're underestimating how much they spoke because they're hopeful and they have the goal in their mind. And when they see it in the app, it I have heard so many times this, wow, I can't believe that I spoke that much. I've used that over a dozen times with classroom observations, and it's a powerful image when they realize, okay, yeah, I've got some work to do without my saying anything.
That's brilliant. And in a Montessori classroom, different than traditional classrooms, Montessorians, there are certainly opportunities for whole group or small group conversations. That certainly happens. And it especially happens once children are in elementary and above, right? Early childhood classrooms, we are striving for a lot of individualized instruction because we're all along a continuum, right? It's where are you at in whatever domain of learning where you want to work on today, and that's where we're going to move forward. But when I hear what you're talking about as a literacy person, what makes me really excited is the opportunity to help children across the age spectrum, to help human beings, including adults, because I can see application for that as well, to help us with our expressive language skills. Because when
Mm.
we think about school, I don't know how much pedagogically we are conscious of time devoted to children's expressive language. Yet we want a graduate from high school, a graduate from college to be skillful and to be ready to be engaged citizens. But yet we haven't been giving them practice all along to be just that. And this is just a tool that, as you said, it makes that ability, that opportunity actually visible. Are you getting the opportunity to say what you need to say?
Susan, when you talk about expressive language, how does a teacher measure that or see that?
So I wear these two hats, traditional education and Montessori education, and I'm trying to only keep the Montessori hat on these days. I made a conscious choice to do that. I can say in traditional classrooms, there are actually tools. There's something called CLASS. It's a classroom observation tool that looks at teacher-child interactions, and it can go through high school. It's looking for tone, it's looking for depth of questions. So I know that there are ways for that to happen. When you brought up earlier about teachers being surprised, I thought, oof, what a great opportunity for a tool like this to be used in higher education or
Hmm.
for teacher education programs, for Montessori programs, um, to use such a tool for a teacher not to be graded on, but a new teacher just to get to an understanding of their own practice in the classroom. So, how do I know? Unless I'm doing observations or some sort of self assessment and I'm really conscious of it, I don't know how it's getting assessed,
Yeah.
right?
Well, it's interesting because as you describe that, one of the features that we added, me and my developer, where we added into equity maps was something called check notes. And it allows you to identify the check note or the quality or characteristic of what someone is sharing. So there's no AI involved. So it's your human intuition or your human measurement, but you can do it live during the conversation and you can add a check note that has taken place or afterwards in the post meeting. And I think this is the most powerful because we just added it. So the teacher can go back and listen to that conversation and identify when they hear the quality. For example, we're often using question stems and they might be lower level question stems or more higher level critical thinking question stems. And in the post production, in the post meeting, the teacher can go in or the student can go in and identify when a student is using one of those stems. And then in the feedback frames in the database at the end, you can identify here are the students who use those. And you can actually go back and then play when they said them because they're aligned to that time.
That's brilliant.
So I could see that as being really powerful in a teacher educator sense that they could each listen to the same lesson, map those examples, and then compare their understanding of what it is they're mapping.
And also, it just helps to raise students' metacognition of their own learning. Oh, that part I said, that's what you were looking for. That's when I was getting it. I think that also helps a student bring more clarity to their learning. Um, Brilliant, brilliant tool.
And and how powerful because then we're making it about better conversations, deeper conversations than about the grade. Anything we can do to get them thinking metacognitively, wow, that's the most powerful, I think.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. Um, there was something that you said also. I think that we should say this out loud. One of the things that I learned about in our email exchanges is that the content, you raised the term AI, the content of anything that's happening in the classroom, the names of the students, that lives within that teacher's iPad, but it does not belong. It's not part of your domain. Is that accurate?
That's correct. And we've been very intentional with that. The data is not shared outside the user's individual iPad. They can share it if they so choose with another user, but they do not have to. And we've added a new possibility that the teacher can send the feedback frames. They can send the data to each individual student. And in those, they can add comments, they can add the characteristics, and they can send them through their school's learning management system or directly to the school's email. So it's all enclosed. We haven't brought in AI at all because I think it's not necessary. Low tech is equally as important in this situation to focus on the conversations at hand, and that's what we're really trying to do.
That's one thing that also led me. We were very um, specific about what we wanted to add. And this just felt like a great tool, very usable tool for so many purposes in the classroom. This tool is in the adolescent chapter of a Montessori classroom. And as I said, we observed it being used, and the teacher wasn't involved. It was a group of adolescents who took the iPad with them. They went into another room and then had their conversation and their planning session, and then were noting what was happening on the app real time. And I was just fascinated by the whole process and thought, what a great, great tool. Because, and this leads me, I think we only have a few minutes left. It leads me to the questions of what does this do you think, to inform students' leadership skills?
I think the most important thing is how we can build agency. What I do really appreciate about Montessori education is this goal of embracing student agency, both individually and as in a group efficacy. And it places the students in a position that they can have control over some of their own learning and how they interact with one another. I remember this story of something that really surprised me as a teacher, maybe in my third or fourth year of using equity maps in the classroom. And I put the data up at the end, and the students noticed that there was no silence in this 40-minute Socratic seminar, a really long Socratic seminar the kids were into. There were maybe 1 or 2 seconds of silence in the entire conversation. And I said, well, tell me about that. And some kids raised their hand and said, it showed we really knew our stuff and that we were really engaged. And I said, did anyone see that differently? And a hand that hadn't said much during the conversation, she raised her hand and she said, and gives me goosebumps to think about this because she said, you know, without silence, I didn't have time to process. I didn't have time to make sense because you all think so fast and you're so smart as she's complimenting her classmates. But she said, why, when we were on to the next idea, I hadn't even thought of the first idea. Oh my gosh, at the end, when we looked at our norms of the group and I said, what's our goal for the next one? They all said we're going to pause more often so that everyone can follow the conversation. Now, when you talk about leadership and you talk about student-led leadership, I, as a teacher, only asked the question, and then they came up with the solutions. And that's what followed in the next conversation. And we showed them, and I don't remember the exact number, but there were minutes of silence rather than seconds. And everyone agreed that that was more powerful for that situation. It was cool.
You're an honorary Montessorian in my book. Because all of what you're describing is exactly what we're hoping for. You know, in these early stages, birth through age 6, students are learning to have agency, they're learning independence. In elementary classrooms, they're still learning more independence, but they're learning to apply it within the classroom environment. And by the time we get to upper L and into adolescence, now we take those skills and yes, we use them in the classroom, but we also begin to use them outside of the classroom. Montessorians in an adolescent classroom might have roles in the community where they're learning, where they're working alongside somebody to learn their job. And they can take these skills, and certainly being able to speak to somebody who may know more than I know, who may have an opposing thought to something that I believe, that all of these opportunities prepare them for this is real world. Dave, I just want to thank you for your brilliance in developing the tool. And I want to thank you for your time helping us to understand the tool. Are there any things that you want to make sure that either teachers or students should know about equity maps? And how can they either find the tool or follow up with you if you so choose?
Thank you so much, Susan. And I think I can sense what you're really good at is connecting people. And that's what we want to do in the classroom. And that's what we want to do in the profession. And I really appreciate your adding equity maps to your book. I've picked it up on Amazon. And next week I've got spring break. So I'm going to read it on the airplane and enjoy it. So I'm really looking forward to that deep dive. Look, Equity Maps is available. It's only on the iPad. All the sales still go back into its development, and there's no subscription model. So we wanted to make it as accessible as possible. So it's a one-time access. It's $9.99 in the App Store. So definitely a deal. And schools that download 20 or more copies can get 50% discount through Apple. So a good deal. I noted in your book that you had some really incredible quotes that seemed to align with my philosophy. You quoted Ted Sizer from 1985. I remember Forrest's Compromise because it was one of those books that reminded me when I was just finishing an education program that teachers talk way too much and let's free it up for students to engage with one another. And in that quote, you said, rather than a pedagogy of telling, according to Sizer, where teachers deliver content to students via lecture, educators of Montessori adolescent classrooms promote a pedagogy of dialogue, is one of facilitator using an inquiry model. Students share their thinking prior to the adult sharing questions, novel materials are offered to encourage discussion. That's what we're about. And I am so appreciative of being aligned and for you reaching out to connect us. And I'm looking forward to learning more about your world. Thank you so much,
I,
Susan.
I think that you need to come to a Montessori conference and share your work too. So we'll work towards that as well.
Love to. Love to.
All right. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Susan. All my best to you and to your colleagues.